Hello, welcome to Healthcare Supervision. We are moving on to Chapter 2, the management functions of health information management. This is a relatively short chapter. We have about 3 sections to cover. We're going to cover the functions of management, the levels of management, and then ethics in health information management. So if you want to start along in your book with me, we're going to start on page 30, and we're going to talk about planning. That's our first function of management. Now, planning is an examination of the future and preparation of action plans to attain goals. You may plan out your meals for the week. You may plan out your study time for the week. Everybody has to have a plan, and we all know that planning comes first. It has to be done first. And as far as our textbook goes, it says planning is the foundation on which the other functions operate. So our other functions are organizing, leading, and controlling. We're going to talk about each of those in depth. Now, we've talked about, probably some point in time, we've talked about strategic plans. But right now, as far as planning goes for healthcare organizations, we're going to talk about 3 types: strategic, tactical, and operational. Now, your strategic plans are coming from the board and from your senior level managers. This is the highest level of management plan you could possibly have. And we're talking about mission and vision and the goals of the organization. It says the organization's overall mission, vision, and goals set the long-term direction of the organization. Strategic plans are generally in place for 3 to 5 years, with annual evaluations performed by the Board of Trustees to ensure that the plan is still relevant. Because if we set a plan here in December of 2019, 5 years from now, in 2024, things may have totally changed in the healthcare world. So every year we want to go back and look at our strategic plan to make sure that we're on the right track and that the environmental things that are going on, again, inside and outside of our organization have stayed the same. Now, then, after we have our strategic plan, your departments are going to create their own plan using that strategic plan as a guideline. So a tactical plan is a shorter term strategic plan, and it focuses on 1 to 3 years. Now, once your overall tactical plan is in place for your department, then you're going to develop your operational plans. This strictly, it sets up how you're going to cover daily operations in your department. Now, usually it's for a year or less, and then as the year goes on, you're going to revise that plan for the next year. It says regardless of whether the planning is done at strategic, tactical, or operational level, there are activities and tools that contribute to the success of any plan. And then we're going to talk about those planning tools. First one is an environmental scan. So this is a systematic and continuous effort to search for important cues about how the world is changing outside and inside the organization. Now, this environmental scan is done at any level, and it should also be done early in the planning process to gather data that will impact the creation of your plan. For example, let's say you're doing a strategic plan, but you know that some law is going to change midway through your year. Well, you would need to know that when creating your plan so that when things change in the environment, they also change within your plan. Now, environmental scanning should be performed both at organizational and departmental levels, and one way to perform the environmental scan is a SWOT analysis. That's our second tool. So a SWOT analysis looks at the internal strengths and weaknesses of an organization or department, and the external opportunities and threats. Internally, the elements over which the organization has control of are examined. And externally, the elements examined are those over which the organization has little, if any, control. A SWOT analysis is not a task list of things to do, but rather a description of the factors that will impact a plan or a project. Now, an example in HIM, a SWOT in healthcare, if you look on page 31, in that blue box, you can read through that SWOT analysis. It breaks it out as Ruth is the HIM director of Memorial Hospital, and she's starting to talk about the implementation of CAC, computer assisted coding. So read through the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats there, so you have a better idea of what SWOT analysis actually is. Now, other planning tools are going to be goals and objectives. Organizational goals and objectives are communicated to all levels so that departments and work areas can use them as a foundation to develop their internal goals and objectives. Goals and objectives are written using the SMART method, which requires that they be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. The SMART method is further detailed in Chapter 9, and we will get there. Once your goals and objectives are written, it becomes the manager's responsibility to create plans to meet them. All right, now if you want to continue on over on to 31, it goes into the bottom of 31, and 32 talks about policies, procedures, and budgets. And we're actually going to get more into those as we get into Chapter 6 and then Chapter 7. But the main thing you want to know is policies should consider legal accrediting and certification mandates, as well as any other requirements imposed by external and internal authorities or sources. And your procedure is going to be the steps given in chronological order that detail the prescribed manner that actual work is done, or how you're actually going to perform the work. And then you have job procedures. They're very specific. They bring departmental plans down to a level of how and by whom the work is carried out. And the budget. A budget is your plan that converts your organizational goals and objectives into targets for revenue and spending. So again, we're going to have chapters on all three of those. All right, so now we're moving on to organizing. So we've finished planning, and now we're going to become responsible for organizing the resources to meet the goals and objectives. So organizing is coordinating of the activities of multiple people to achieve a common purpose or a goal. An organization decides how best to accomplish its work and divides labor accordingly. A common division of labor in healthcare is departmentalization by function. So you have a nursing department, you have a respiratory department, you have an HIM department, you have housekeeping, maintenance, patient financial services. Division of labor by function allows for specialization among employees, which leads to efficiency and quality of patient care. And so, for example, your HIM department, those are divided into functional groups. You have a coding staff, you have transcriptionists, you have your release of information clerks. So those are based on function. And we're going to talk a lot more about HIM and how it is structured when we get to Chapter 11. Now, organizational structure is determined by senior management and is illustrated by an organizational chart. Now, again, we're going to kind of get into that organizational charts later on again. And this whole section here kind of talks about span of control. Well, span of control we're going to talk about in Chapter 11 as well. But what we need to know here for span of control is that, let's think about this in terms of an HIM department. So there's no ideal number of direct reports for an HIM manager, but there are factors that should be taken into consideration when determining an appropriate span of control. So the skills and abilities of the supervisor. So if they are competent in their role, talking about our manager, then they're able to take on a larger span of control. And in addition, when employees are more competent and have specialized skills, this allows a manager to have a larger span of control too. So when your employees are specialized, their jobs, that they know more about their jobs, they have these high-level skills, they're going to require less intervention from their manager. So your manager has a little bit of breathing room there. They don't necessarily have to micromanage everything. They're not going to have 15 questions come up every day because, again, these employees are skilled and have knowledge to complete their job function. Second, geographical proximity of employees to each other and the manager. Now, as students, you have seats that you sit in and you have people that you sit by. Those people are the ones that you ask questions to. Okay, well, it works the same way in your job. You sit by people at work. Those people are going to be the ones you ask questions to. So if you are close to your coworkers, then you're going to ask your coworker the question instead of going and finding your supervisor or your manager. And when you work in-house and you do have that physical proximity to each other, again, those questions are easier answered. If you are a remote coder and you are in your home all day long by yourself, you don't have anybody to ask a question to. Now, you can utilize email or you can pick up the phone, but physical proximity is what's going to help that manager have a better span of control. Now, it talks about remote employees and that geographical proximity becomes an issue when dealing with remote employees. The ability for a manager to be in contact with remote employees will impact the size of the span of control. Now, as a manager, I don't know what you're doing at home, but you have productivity that you have to meet, so you better be doing your job. But I don't have quite as much control over you as I do someone physically sitting in the same office space with me. All right, the next one, presence of policies and procedures. So again, when you have up-to-date policy and procedure manuals, rules, and clear guidelines for employees to follow, the less likely they're needing their manager. Next, similarity of supervised task. If I am a manager and I only manage coders who all have the same job responsibility and have to do the same kind of task, that span of control can stay large and I can manage more people because they're all doing the same function. Now, if I'm the department head and I do not have any managers or any supervisors in my department, my span of control is it's kind of tough because I've got people doing release of information, I've got people scanning, I've got people transcribing, I've got people coding. So similarity of supervised task just makes it so much easier for the manager because less of their time is needed. All right, last one, frequency of interaction between managers and their employees. So managers have to interact frequently with employees, and they are more limited in the number of employees they can oversee. So if I have to spend a lot of time with my staff, then I may not need to have a lot of staff members because what else can I do with my time if I'm too busy or so busy interacting with my staff all of the time? Now, I have a smaller span of control when I have to interact frequently. But it talks about technology being available to aid in that communication process, then that span of control may increase. So again, we're going to talk more about span of control when we get to chapter 11. Now, it talks about that span of control is related to delegation. Now, we don't have a slide for this. Again, these slides are more condensed. But delegation is the process in which your managers distribute work to others along with the authority to make decisions and take action. Delegation is a skill that managers must develop or they will end up doing most of the work of the department by themselves. Managers over-delegate when their time management skills are weak or when they're unsure of their own ability to complete a task. Managers under-delegate when they do not trust their employees to complete a task because of lack of ability or lack of time. And managers improperly delegate when they choose the wrong person, time, or the reason for delegating a task. And so again, with delegation, you give someone authority. Well, authority is the right to make decisions and take actions necessary to carry out assigned task. Now, if I give you a task, but I do not give you the authority that goes along with completing that task, then you can't really do what I've asked you to do. Now, as far as delegation goes, there are 5 steps to effective delegation. First, you got to pick the right person. You match the person to the job, not the job to the person. The individual has to have the correct skill set and the desire to actually complete that function. So if I know you hate spreadsheets with a passion, you don't like Excel, and I give you a spreadsheet to maintain, I didn't pick the right person. Second, specify the desired result. I have to communicate clearly, whether I do that in person or email, carrier pigeon, whatever. But the outcome has to be so specific that there's no question as to whether or not you carried out that job correctly. So I have to be very specific with the desired result when I delegate the task to you. Third, a deadline has to be in place. You have to know when the project is due. I have to know when the project is due. If priorities change, then everyone needs that communication. Everybody has to have a realistic expectation of when the project is due. Next one, determine authority. Now, once I delegate a task to you, I have to decide what level of authority I'm going to give to the employee. Now, when I give that authority, I've got to let go. I can't micromanage you. The whole point of delegation is to free up my time as a manager. So if I give you the task, I've chosen the deadline, I give you the authority to complete the task, I have to step away. Now, even though I did give you that authority, we're coming down to step 5, I am going to track the progress. I will monitor that, and I will provide guidance if you ask for it. But that's not micromanaging. That's just making sure everything's on track. I'm not looking over your shoulder every 5 minutes to make sure you're doing things my way or the right way. I've given you the authority. I'm stepping away, but I am going to check in with you to make sure things are going smoothly. So that's talking about delegation. Now, the last little section here under organizing talks about staffing. Now, this is a managerial function concerned with determining the most appropriate and cost-effective mix of individuals necessary to complete job functions in the department. And we're going to get into more of that when we move into Chapter 8, when we're talking about recruiting, selection, and we get into compensation. All right, so let's move on to our third function of management, which is going to be leading. Now, following planning and organizing is leading. This is the management function in which people are directed and motivated to achieve goals. It's sometimes referred to as actuating, directing, or influencing. We're going to get into some more key concepts of leading when we get into Chapter 5 when we talk about change management. Now, let's talk about leadership power. Now, we talked in the first chapter that leaders may not necessarily be in a managerial role. They could just be that charismatic person that people want to follow. So what we're talking about here is social power. It's the potential or ability of an agent, in this case we're talking about a manager specifically, to bring change in attitudes, behavior, or belief by using resources available to him or her. Now, within each organization, as you can see on the slide, we have 6 sources of social power. The first one is legitimate. Legitimate power is a formal power that's granted to an individual based on their position in the organization. Okay? So the director of HIM has the power to influence the behavior and task of people that report to her because she's the top dog. So she has a legitimate power based on holding the position of HIM director. Now, we have reward power. Again, this is another formal type of power. This is granted to an individual who has the ability to reward employees for doing what is requested of them. This could be a raise, a promotion, time off, or any other positive measure. Now, this could be within your department, you create an employee of the month, and you might get a gift card to Walmart for being the employee of the month. Well, that's reward power. Then we have coercive power. This is almost the opposite of reward power. So in reward power, we have the ability to reward our employees. Well, in coercive power, we have the ability to punish our employees. So if you are not doing what is requested of you, then punishment may come in the form of a demotion or a poor performance appraisal or an undesirable work assignment. I may punish you with that Excel worksheet that you hate so much. All right, so let's talk about expert power. Now, this is a personal power in which, regardless of their position, so it doesn't matter, this power is perceived in an individual who is the subject matter expert. Others recognize this knowledge, skills, and experience in a particular field and look to them to be a leader. So if you have a coder that has worked in your department for 25, 30 years, you may look to them as the expert, the subject matter expert in coding, and that may be who you go to first when you have questions. So that is expert power. Then you have referent power. So again, this is another personal power. These leaders possess personal characteristics that make others want to be like them or to follow them or want to be associated with them. So this is basically someone that, again, we talked about in chapter 1, that charismatic leader, someone that just has that personality that you gravitate to that person based on their personality. So referent power, they may be smart and fair and trustworthy and kind, and you just want to be their friend. You want to be around them. Our last one is informational. Again, this is a power based on the leader possessing information. The information could be about a future project, a new implementation, something going on in the organization that you are in the know about. And so your power comes from you knowing information. Now, once they, legitimate, reward, and coercive, again, those all depend on the manager's position. Once they leave the position, the power disappears. Expert and referent power are personal in nature. They don't depend on the person's position. Informational is entirely based on content. So again, it doesn't matter who you are, where you work, anything like that. It just comes with what you know. Sorry guys, I'm having to let my dog outside. She's gonna start barking at me. All right, so let's move on to communication in leading. So we're going to talk about 3 different kinds of communication here. We have oral or verbal, another word for that. We have written, and we have visual. Now, you're all familiar with visual, oral and visual, because you just completed your PPE notebooks and your PPE presentations. So let's talk about these. Okay, so oral or verbal communication can be in person or over the telephone. An HIM manager uses oral communication to give directions, complete performance appraisals, and deliver disciplinary action. The benefits to oral communication involve the availability of immediate feedback and the ability to read non-verbal cues. So we're talking like body language here. If I'm talking to you and I'm telling you about a project or I'm telling you about an assignment that I need you to complete for me, and you got these wrinkled, furrowed eyebrows, then I get that immediate feedback that you don't know what I'm talking about. Or maybe I'm not explaining myself well. So I have that immediate feedback and I can read those nonverbal cues. Now I can adjust my message at that time because I see it. I know that you're not understanding me. Now, one of the things that is not a benefit of verbal communication is it's not recorded anywhere unless you get me on tape recorder. So if I have a conversation with you in my office and I've told you I need you to complete this assignment and I give you some instructions, that's not in writing anywhere. There's no visual that you can go back and lean on. It's just word of mouth. Now, when speaking to others, the speaker should be upbeat, confident, honest and sincere, and follow these suggested best practices. So first, speak loudly enough so all can hear, especially when you're addressing a group. The message should be clear and concise. Do not add words simply to add length to the message. Make use of hands and facial expressions to emphasize key points in the message. Now, we all know those people that talk with their hands. I talk with my hands all the time. Use eye contact to capture the attention of listeners. Stand up straight and erect to put force behind the message. Be careful not to use sounds such as and that distract from the message. It's best just to pause when speaking if you need to gather your thoughts. And last, keep the focus on finding solutions when discussing problems. Now we're moving into written communication. So this is another skill that an HIM manager needs to develop in order to effectively communicate in the workplace. Now, this may come in the form of a memo or an email. It may be a policy or a procedure, or even the employee's performance appraisal. Or maybe you wanted a new piece of equipment for your department and you have to do a budget justification. Written communication lacks the immediate feedback that you get with verbal communication, but there is a permanent record that can be referred to later. Now, best practices for written communication are, number one, be concise. Try to keep an email to no more than 5 or 6 sentences, and a memo to no more than 1 page. If it's too much, they're not going to read it all. I promise you. Second, maintain a friendly yet professional tone when writing emails and memos. Third, proofread carefully. Use spell check, please. Fourth, use simple language to convey meaning instead of impressive or flowery words. Do not make me have to get out a dictionary to read your 1-paragraph memo. Simple, again, be concise. Explain all abbreviations and unfamiliar terms the first times you use them. For example, not everyone knows that CMS stands for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or that HIM means Health Information Management. Do not send an email or memo when angry or upset. Let it sit until the emotions have cooled. Then consider whether a phone call or an in-person meeting would be a better method of handling the situation. And last, if a document is especially important, think back to that budget justification. Check for understanding by reading it out loud or letting it sit for a day or two and then rereading it with fresh eyes. If possible, let somebody else read it for you. And then last, visual. Visual communication consists of media such as PowerPoint presentations or the use of graphs and charts in written reports. HIM managers may present to a local HIM association meeting or give a career talk to an HIM class at a local community college. Visual aids enhance a presentation by making it more interesting and helping the visual learners in the group understand the material better. A report with appropriate graphs or charts helps the reader to visualize statistics or data that could be difficult to put into words. Visual communication uses many of the same best practices as oral and written communication, being concise, proofreading for spelling or grammar errors, and using plain language. and the use of color and labeling of data displays are important to enhancing meaning. Now, we're going to skip this next section, but what I do want you to know is that your HIM managers are going to communicate daily with bosses, peers, and employees. And so you have two components to communicating with a boss. First, understanding their expectations, and then upward communication. Now, if we flip over to 36, you have this whole long paragraph here. And it's talking about the different, or several paragraphs, but you have the different types of communication. So we have upward. This is initiated by an employee to their supervisor. So if I'm an employee, my manager is directly above me in that organizational chart, so that's upward if I'm talking to my manager. Now, if my manager comes to me with something, they are a level above me and then they're coming down to me, so that's downward communication. We're talking about lateral when we're talking peer-to-peer, so if we're both inpatient coders, then you're my peer. And if we're talking diagonal, we're talking a supervisor to employee or employee to supervisor in another department, okay? So be sure to read page 36 so that you're understanding that information as well. Now, we have communication barriers in everyday life, in school, in work, wherever. But your HIM managers have to deal with those barriers to communication. Some of these could be physical. Again, geography. There may be noise, maybe the way the office is laid out. Managers that have employees who work remotely, they have to deal with communication either by the phone, by text messaging, or sending an email. So there's a loss of those nonverbal cues. I don't get to see your facial expressions. I don't get to see your body language. Now in chapter 10, it starts talking about video conference technology, and sometimes that could be an option if your hospital has that. Now, diversity and cultural differences can also be barriers to communication. People who speak English as a second language, they just may not find the right words or be able to understand what I'm saying. And then cultural issues, such as personal space or gender roles, can also impact that message transmission from sender to receiver. People, status, feelings of inequality, that's another. If we're in different positions, you may not feel comfortable coming and speaking to me if I'm the department head and you're a scan tech. You may not feel comfortable coming and talking to me. And then we also have pronunciation. You've all seen the words and terms that get used in healthcare, and some people just aren't comfortable trying to pronounce those words, or maybe they picked the wrong word, or there's certain unique terms that they're not familiar with. So sometimes this can lead to confusion and misunderstanding between senders and receivers. Now, the other big thing I just want to make sure that you're aware of is that communication, back over on 34, communication is always two-way, okay? I said it over on the top of 37. There's a sender and there's a receiver. Sender is the one giving the message, whether it's a memo or a voicemail, or I'm actually speaking to you in conversation. I'm the one that is sending the information out. The receiver, the one reading that memo or picking up the phone and dialing into their voicemail and listening to that message, or you're sitting and looking at me face to face while I speak to you, you're the receiver of the communication. So it's always two-way. Whether there's someone in front of you when you're writing an email and sending that out or not, you still have a recipient that is receiving your message. All right, back to 37. We're going to move on to controlling. So planning and organizing lead directly to controlling or evaluating function of management. Controlling is the monitoring and correcting of organizational, departmental, and individual performance so goals and objectives are met. Controlling is dependent on goals, objectives, and key indicators being set during the planning phase. Key indicators are quantifiable measures used over time to determine whether some structure, process, or outcome supports high-quality performance measured against best practice criteria. And if you want to see an example in HIM of key indicators, you've got the bottom of 37. We have our HIM manager who's overseeing coding and release of information. And she's gone to a planning retreat, and so she's looking at indicators for telephone courtesy complaints, release of information, turnaround time, and the number of completed physician queries. So if you want to read about key indicators, read that section. All right, so let's talk about methods of controlling performance. So performance appraisals are a method of controlling individual performance. The performance appraisal process requires that key job performance indicators be established during the review and monitored throughout the appraisal period. Correction of any deviations should happen when they occur so that the employee is not surprised during the annual review. So if something pops up and, I know you made a mistake, I need to let you know then that you made a mistake. I don't need to wait until the end of the performance appraisal period and let you know at your final review that you made a mistake 6 months ago. You should never not know something as an employee when it's time to do a performance appraisal. You should know exactly what has happened throughout that appraisal period. All right, our next thing is benchmarking. We're going to talk about this more in Chapter 9, as well as our performance appraisals. But this is another way of controlling performance. Managers obtain benchmark data for key indicators from other similar facilities or professional organizations and compare their performance against the benchmark data. Areas that are either significantly higher or lower than the benchmark data are reviewed. And you have an example here about coding volume from children's hospitals, if you want to read an example in HIM. Now, another controlling method is budget. We talked about a budget earlier. So budgeting becomes a control tool after it's completed. Now, the annual budget is approved prior to the start of the fiscal year, which sometimes runs January to December, maybe July to June. I know at North Mississippi Medical Center it runs October to September. But a monthly review of each budget category will allow that HIM manager to see whether they're spending too much money or have budgeted too much money for any one item. Now, other controlling tools are dashboards and scorecards. A dashboard is a report of process measures to help leaders follow progress to assist with strategic planning. Dashboards are quick snapshots of the status of key performance indicators. A dashboard functions much the same as the dashboard in a car. With a quick glance, a driver can tell the speed, gas level, and mileage of the vehicle they're operating. Detailed information is provided, but just enough so that the driver knows the status of the car at one point in time. So we're talking about a snapshot. A scorecard is a report of outcome measures to help leaders know what they have accomplished. Rather than reporting ongoing process measures, a scorecard looks at outcomes. A scorecard is a long-term report of how the organization is meeting its strategic goals. So it is not just a snapshot in time. I know our scorecard in the HIM department at Tupelo, it was a monthly thing. We sent it to our CFO and our revenue cycle VP monthly. So we had that ongoing report showing us how we did month after month after month. All right, so let's talk about the levels of management really quickly. We're not going to get too much into this. I'll let you read that on your own. But the 4 management functions that we've just talked about, planning, organizing, leading, and controlling, they're done at all levels of management, whether you're in the C-suite or whether you are a first-time supervisor with 2 employees. You do all of those functions of management. Now, usually we have 3 levels of management in healthcare. You have your top level, your middle level, or your lower level. Now, your lower level can also be called frontline supervisor or your first line supervisor. Now, let's go back to the top. Top, board of trustees. They are the top dog when it comes to your hospitals. So your board of trustees, and then your senior management team. Your senior management team is what we call the C-suite. All of their titles begin with the C. CEO, COO, CFO. So those people like your chief executive officer, your chief operating officer, your chief financial officer. Those are all top level management positions. Then we go down into the middle level. They sit right below that top level. Middle level managers include department heads or senior managers or assistant department heads or managers. So your director of the HIM department, they are a middle level manager. Then you have that lower level. This is your bottom of the organizational chart when it comes to management. Again, they're known as first level or frontline management, and these may be supervisors in HIM or your lower level managers. If you're in a clinic, it could be your office manager. Okay? All right, now, last little section in this chapter is ethics and health information management. Now, in most organizations, the individuals who hold management positions in the HIM department also have HIM credentials. Now, this is what you're going to school for, that HIM credential, the RHIT. These managers oversee employees in the health information department who also have HIM credentials. An HIM credential carries an obligation to follow the credentialing body's code of ethics, such as AHIMA's Code of Ethics. Now, ethics is a field of study that deals with moral principles, theories, and values. A code of ethics is a statement of ethical principles regarding business practices and professional behavior. And if you continue to read through that section, we have the AHIMA Code of Ethics proposed 13 principles. I'm not going to read through each one of those, so you be sure to read through those. Dropping down to the bottom of that page, now your HIM manager is going to deal with each of these principles in their workplace and may even have the principles included as part of their performance evaluation measures. A manager arranges and participates in continuing education, recruits other credentialed individuals to open positions, adheres to release of information policies and procedures that protect health information, and collaborate daily with other healthcare professionals to support health information practice. So that code of ethics can become part of your job description. Now, in addition to the code of ethics, there is also ethical standards for coding professionals and CDI professionals, clinical documentation improvement. HIM managers should be aware of these guiding principles and require that coding and data abstraction professionals, whether they have that HIM credential or not, they should follow a standard of ethical coding, such as the AHIMA standards of ethical coding. So I may have a CCS, or I may have an RHIT, or I may not have an RHIT or a CCS. If I am coding, I should be following the AHIMA standards of ethical coding, whether I have a credential or not. Let's move over to page 41. We're going to go down to that first paragraph there. The Code of Ethics is a tool that HIM managers have to hold employees accountable for their actions and to support the manager's ethical decision making. Ethical decisions are part of any manager's job description. Sometimes the decision is fairly straightforward and can be guided by laws such as HIPAA or internal policies and procedures, but often ethical decisions prove to be difficult. There's no common moral code. Everyone has different morals. And individuals vary that interpretation of what is right and wrong. So what's right to me may be wrong to you. Using a step-by-step approach to ethical decision-making can help a manager to remain objective and remove personal feelings and emotions from the situation. So I want to say that we had something very similar to this in PI, and you actually had to list those steps. But the steps here are: first, define the situation, identify the options, evaluate the options, select the optimal or the best option, implement the decision, and then evaluate the outcome. Defining the situation means clearly determining what happened and who was involved. The facts of the situation must be gathered objectively as the decision maker begins to collect the laws, rules, and regulations that are going to help to identify various options for moving forward. As many potential solutions as possible should be identified at this time. A manager may be the only one involved in this step, but there may be an ethics committee or panel who participates as well. It's also possible to include the individuals involved in the situation. They may have options to consider. And remember that one option is always do nothing. So once all your options have been identified, they must be evaluated. This is where consideration of applicable laws, rules, or regulations is given. It may be necessary to consider the cost of various alternatives as well as the short and long-term consequences of each one. Does an option affect only one or two individuals involved in the situation, or is there an impact on the larger community to consider? The decision maker must choose from the available options and implement a decision. And your final step is evaluating the outcome of the decision. At this point, the decision maker can consider whether or not the optimal option was chosen. Lessons are learned from the experience, including how identical or similar situations can be avoided in the future. A good practice at this last step is to record the entire decision-making process for the future. All right, so that finishes up chapter 2. Again, that was a relatively short chapter. You're going to have to answer your review questions. Again, happy studying, happy reading. Again, use these slides to go back in and just define these terms and be familiar with each of the concepts. And happy reading.